they said, and I don't know how true it is, that there was a problem at the center of the network. Now, I don't know what that means, but all I know is that it was the other night and yesterday, I finally had internet.
That's really good.
And they should give you a refund for all.
They do that. Yeah, but this started in February. So I lost a lot of time on things I wanted to do, and research and some stuff like that. And I feel like a twit.
Well, they told you you're not, so you're okay.
No, they did not tell me I was not a twit.
That it wasn't your fault.
Yeah.
I would interpret that to be the same thing.
Rabbi Jim?
Hello,
Rabbi
everybody.
Jim?
Hello.
Did you
Hi,
get
Rabbi.
the email?
So, all right. So,
Rabbi Jim?
yeah, what's up?
You made two typos. You said April 10th and 11th when it's the 17th and the 18th.
Where did I make that mistake?
On the weekly guide that you sent,
Oh, I'm so sorry.
it said April 10th and April 11th after April 16th. It should be the 17th and the 18th.
All right. I apologize. I will look at that and make sure it's right next week. Thanks for letting me know, Ellen. I appreciate it.
Okay.
All right, great. So, hello to everybody.
Hello.
We're a little bit smaller group than usual today, so we'll see. I don't remember if Kent told me that she wasn't going to be able to make it. I can't remember, but anyway, I have already remembered to put it up on YouTube, so people will be able to get access to it. I'm getting nervous because I think it is now 13 weeks in a row. We've put this up on YouTube, so we're just waiting for the first time that I forget. So we will try to avoid that and continue to have our meetings archived. So you go back and feel free to go back and have a look. So what I thought what we would do is this week we would finally get to the two pieces from Heschel that I sent around, and we can go through those and sort of discuss. I mean, Heschel is obviously very very important book in American Jewish life in the last century, right? The Sabbath, and it's got sort of Heschel's great sort of epigraphic kind of almost poetic kind of. There we go. And it also is, it's also quite. I was remembering as I was reading the introduction, rereading the introduction today, that he really is setting himself in opposition, right, to the 20th century emphasis on technical civilization, right, and bringing out this sort of notion from Bertrand Russell and from Nikolai Berdyaev, so people from different traditions, right? That time is kind of nothing, or time is a demon, or time is unimportant, right? And for Heschel, them's fighting words, right? Time is actually the essence of Judaism. It's the essence of existence. And
the essence of history.
And well, certainly the essence of history, right? Absolutely, right. But more than just history, I think, is what he would want to say. right? And that there are time sort of works in a variety of different cycles, right? There's historical time, to be sure, right? There's time is limited by the moon, right? And I just finished the Red Tent. If you haven't read, the Red Tent, or you haven't read it in a while, I recommend it. Which is interesting in its emphasis on the moon, right? On the phases of the moon, and how, and that's a big part of Judaism, right? That the months are forever. We are, one thing that I may have mentioned this already. One thing I love about the Apple Watch is that it tells me what the date is according to the Gregorian calendar, and it tells me what the date is according to what they call the lunar calendar. But it's actually the Jewish calendar. So at the bottom of my watch, it says 27 Nisan, right? Which means that, that pretty soon it's going to be Rosh Chodesh again, right? So, and so being attuned to time is very important. The thing that he says towards the end of that introduction, which I think is also really important, right, is that Shabbat doesn't care about months, right? Shabbat doesn't care about the cycles of the moon. It doesn't care about the other holidays, right? It's a different understanding of time, right? It's the time of creation, right? So we have 6 days of creation, and then we have the 7th day, right? When the Bible tells us that God rested, right? And we are enjoined as well to rest. All right, so
I have an observation about that whole thing about resting.
yeah,
It's interesting because he doesn't, I mean, in Genesis, he doesn't talk about, and I created the bugs and I created this and but I created, but then I rested. It's like, all right, already, it's obvious, so why does he do that? And that's where we get the meaning of Shabbat, as far as I'm concerned, because he emphasized it.
Right. Well, right. I mean, and Heschel points out, right, that the first thing in the Bible that's called holy, right, is not anything on the first 6 days of creation, right? No. Nothing in the realm of space is considered holy. What is considered holy is Shabbat, right? Shabbat is considered holy. Shabbat is blessed. Shabbat is considered holy, and I think that does really point out, right, what is it's actually interesting because so much of Judaism, based on the first chapter of Genesis, right, is based on distinctions, making distinctions, separating things one for the other, right? And the root of the word kadosh, right, holiness, is separating it, setting it apart. And so in this world where everything is being distinguished one from another, right, the thing that is really set apart as being special is indeed Shabbat. All right, so let's look at that. Yeah, go ahead, Maya.
I enjoyed your question last week about what are we doing to make Shabbat special and what are we doing to make it more special?
Yes.
And when I went to services last week, and Rachel came around with Talit, and I said, oh, I don't have the custom of doing that, which I never had, but I thought that would be very nice to adopt. So the next time I went to service, I got one. And I guess sometime when we're in person, I need a little lesson on how you fold it and drape it what way and that.
Yeah.
I would try that one on for a while. And I thought that was a very valuable question that you asked us.
Yeah, well, I have to, I mean, I expressed my gratitude in the note I sent this morning, but I should probably, what's the word, to repeat that today, because I will say that, you know, it was really quite meaningful for me to have the opportunity to think about that question with this group, and to hear from various people. And I'll report that last Friday night I went home after services and I lit the Shabbat candles for the first time in my new apartment. This is after an entire year of not doing it. So
Yeah, wow.
very grateful to this group.
Very nice.
And, you know, just in case you were wondering, right? Just in case you were worried, like, oi, is it worth doing these things I haven't done in my whole life? You know, like, and it's sort of like, you know, just, you know, that any spiritual practice that's meaningful to you, right, is worth adopting whenever you adopt it. And very often you don't know if something is going to be meaningful to you until you adopt it. You've actually got to kind of test drive it a little bit.
Rabbi, my rabbi in Portland, Rabbi Ariel, would tell people that if they hadn't the custom of lighting Shabbat candles, they should try it for a year.
Yeah.
And then see how they felt about it.
Right, exactly.
I'm going to mention about the Tali. There's a prayer that I say before I put on my Tali, when I'm going to do Boker Tov or Torah study, etc. And I find that prayer centers me.
Yeah.
And so when I put on the Talit, it becomes a sacred space.
Yeah. Absolutely. And actually that is really worth looking at. So if we have time today, I don't want to get too derailed, because I mean, you know me, I'm ready to be derailed at any moment. But I'm going to propose that we don't get derailed on that right now, but that if this is something that is of interest to enough of us, I would be very happy to discuss the traditional prayer that's in the prayer book for donning the talit, which I love, and I'm not much of a memorizer. You know, I learned very early from a beloved rabbi that rabbis should never recite anything by memory unless they absolutely had to. Which is not to say you shouldn't memorize things. It's just you should always have the book in front of you. One thing that I have memorized, because it's hard to hold a prayer book and put on your talis at the same time, is the series of prayers that are said in the context of donning the talis. So I'm happy to at some point share those. All right, so let's get started here. Actually, I think it would make sense to start with the second piece first. So both of these are excerpts from the Sabbath. The first piece comes from this book, which I think I made a Xerox for you and sent it around, a Shabbat Haggadah, right, playing off the idea of a Shabbat table being kind of like a Seder, right, where it's not just a matter of saying a few blessings and having a meal, but it also should be a time for learning, right? So it has all the blessings but then it has in here, I think, it actually has 12. It has 12 study texts, and one of the ones is this piece, but I took it from the actual book from the Sabbath book rather than from the Shabbat Haggadah. And then the second piece comes from this volume, which is called Abraham Joshua Heschel Essential Writings, which is selected and edited by his daughter Susanna Heschel, who is a sometimes congregant of the Worship and Study Minyan, and sometimes a congregant at KI, but a formidable scholar in her own right, and a great carrier of her father's legacy. And so this was what she considered the most crucial piece of his book, The Sabbath. So I thought, people we can trust. Susanna Heschel on Abraham Joshua Heschel.
Wow.
One of those people. So we can argue about it. If you know the book well, you can say Suzanne is completely wrong, and we should have focused on a different piece of it. And I'm willing to have that conversation. But so I'm just going to read through, and feel free to stop me when anything sort of grabs your attention, or if you have a comment or a question, or an objection, because remember, Heschel is many things, but he is also Jewish, and so objections and disagreements are more than kosher. All right, to set apart 1 day a week for freedom, a day on which we would not use any instruments which have been so easily turned into weapons of destruction, a day for being with ourselves, a day of detachment from the vulgar, of independence of external obligations, a day on which we stop worshiping the idols of technical civilization. Right? Remember, he wrote, this was published in the 50s, right? So,
Oh, computers then.
Not yet.
this was published in 1951, right? So the idols of technical civilization have only grown more powerful, right?
Yeah.
We barely had television at that point.
Yeah.
Right.
We
I mean,
didn't have one until a year or so later than that.
I mean, I
Right.
think he also means, as comes up in the context of the chapter about the Romans, right? Bathhouses and
Mhm.
roads and markets and supermarkets, whatever sort of thing. Technical civilization. It's easy, especially for someone my age or younger, right, to sort of look at the high tech of today and think that somehow, right, 1950 was a low tech era, right? Remember, we had just won, the Americans, right, and along with the British had defeated the Germans and the Japanese in a highly technical, mechanized war. That's the first thing that comes to mind, right? The age of science is not the 20th century; it's the 19th century, right? So it's the emphasis is pretty strong.
We hadn't gotten into the Korean War yet.
Not yet, right?
But we had discovered radar, which the
Right.
Russians actually did.
Eddie Lamar discovered radar.
Exactly.
Yes.
Mhm.
All right, so it's a day on which, let's see, a day on which we use no money, a day of armistice in the economic struggle with our fellow men and the forces of nature. Is there any institution that holds out a greater hope for man's progress than the Sabbath? Right? And it's interesting to me that there's all kinds of groups now who are encouraging us to take a tech Shabbos, right?
Mhm.
At least until Zoom, at least until the pandemic. And now, as I mentioned last week, right, it's a new kind of a struggle. I don't think, right, anymore that we can just say, I don't use tech on Shabbos, right?
Mhm.
I think it's gonna be, that would be sort of like saying, I don't open the refrigerator on Shabbos or something like this,
Mhm.
right? It'll have to be, how do we use our technology on, how do we use our technology on Shabbat, right? So that it's consistent with Shabbat, right? Anyway, so the solution of mankind's most vexing problem will not be found in renouncing technical civilization, right? Not in being a technophobe, right? Or rejecting technological innovations, right? But in attaining some degree of independence from it, right? Some capacity for perspective. That, part of the point of social media is for you to lose all perspective, to do nothing but social media, right? So, in regard to external gifts, to outward possessions, there is only one proper attitude: to have them and not be able to do without them. Right? It's not a question, right, of not having a telephone or not having a car or not whatever it is, right? I mean, those are individual decisions, right? But it's not, to be independent of them is not to say that you don't have them, right? You may have them and rely on them, but right, you have to be independent. In
And it
regard
seems
to
like
Isn't it
Oh.
more proper to use the term perspective than independence?
I think that what he means.
I think he means them the same way.
Right, I think that's right, but I think when he's the reason he's saying independence, right? I think is actually somewhat important, right? That there's a and he gets at this sort of later in the chapter, right? He does compare it to political independence, right? And it's freedom of the self, and so I think that language is actually significant. Whether it's appropriate or not is a different question, but I do think it's significant that he uses that language.
In that context, I would agree, but independence, if someone were to assume from reading the sentence to gain independence from, it would almost imply a rejection.
Well, I mean, I think that's what he's saying, right? Is that independence Davka does not mean renouncing, right?
Right.
Right. I mean, right. The vexing problem will not be found in renouncing technical civilization, but attaining some degree of independence. Right. It's all. I mean, it's all about balancing. I think for him, right? How do you remain free at the same time as you are, Davka not free, right? To rely on something means that you're not free of it, right? So, he wants to acknowledge our reliance. Like, I can't get by without Zoom, right? I also want to be independent of Zoom, right? Whereas like Facebook, I made a decision that independence from Facebook basically means that all I do with Facebook is I see who has it sends me who has posted something, and then I decide, do I have time and interest to go and look at it? But I never scroll through Facebook, right? So is that a renouncing of, say, Facebook? Another friend of mine has renounced Facebook. He's not even on it, right? So I mean, each person obviously has to make Heschel is talking in these sort of very general ways. Right?
Sounds like you're being independent of it by just looking at the titles. So if
Right.
there's anything urgent, or if it's one of your family members that you want to talk to on Shabbat.
Exactly. Right. Like I saw a friend. It was funny. I was on my run yesterday. I was thinking of a friend whom I haven't seen in years now. Who I don't even know if she still is. She was a runner, right? And then this morning, as I was just sort of scanning that part of my, that category of my email, her name popped up, and so I looked at her post and responded to it. So that that works for me. Obviously, each person, and I think that gets to, right. On one hand, that's kind of a homely example. On the other hand, right, it gets to, I think, something that's also real, right, is that when Heschel is talking, right, he loves to talk in this sort of very grand, generalized kind of language, right? But Heschel, just like everyone else, he's a smart enough rabbi to know that each person is going to find their own way, right, their own definition of what constitutes independence. Right, there's what the tradition says, right, and then there's where the rubber hits the road, right?
So do you think we're talking about this all in terms of things that didn't exist when Heschel wrote this?
I don't know.
Not really.
No, just a minute. Let me finish the other half of the sentence. We're talking now in terms of computers and email and Facebook, which he knew nothing of when this was written. But do you think, because I do not think, that he would say that if you relied on an electric wheelchair to get around, that on Shabbat you should use a manual wheelchair only and reject the technology that gives you the freedom to move yourself?
Right, and so these, what you're getting into, Lori, right, is exactly kind of the question that I was mentioning before, right? Which which we can call it the kavod habriot problem. Kavod habriot means respect for every living person, right? Or every living being, right? Which suggests that a person's quality of life is more important than punctilious Shabbat observance, right?
Mhm.
So when I get my cochlear implant, right, should I be able to use it on Shabbos, right? Do I need it on Shabbos? I mean, I get by pretty well right now without it, right? Would it make my experience of life better? It's a kind of a gray area. Someone who doesn't have any hearing and has a cochlear implant, the question is pretty clear. Yeah, you use the cochlear implant every day, including Shabbos, right? But remember that from his perspective, right, he's thinking about the rabbis who put together the rules of Shabbat when there weren't cars or skyscrapers or trains, right? President Biden was just on the radio this morning talking about how the definition of infrastructure keeps changing, right? And so when opponents of his infrastructure bill complain that, this or that is not infrastructure, he can say, well, 200 years ago, locomotives were not infrastructure. No one knew what they were, right? And 100 years ago, highways weren't infrastructure because we didn't have highways connecting our big cities, right? So so I think that's true in terms of Shabbat as well, right? What is Shabbos dich and what constitutes malacha, right? Labor or work as regards Shabbat is always going to be in flux, right? Because the world doesn't stop changing. And so I honestly believe, right, that we are going to be I think probably even in modern Orthodoxy. Remember, like 10 years ago, even in modern Orthodoxy, they were like, no way, no how is there ever going to be female clergy, and all of a sudden we have rabbis and we have people who call themselves rabbis, and we have people who are madrichot and whatever, and so. My guess is that attitudes about technology are going to be, as people start wearing their tech around, people are going to have to make adjustments in communal life. But anyway, so on the Sabbath, we live, as it were, independent of technical civilization. We abstain primarily from any activity that aims at remaking or reshaping the things of space.
There's a danger into that.
I'm sorry?
There's a danger to that. When my mother was taken ill and right on Shabbat, my brother, who was very religious, tried to reach me on the phone, and I had been experimenting with Shabbat at that time, so I didn't answer the phone.
Yeah.
And it was driving him crazy, because he was in the hospital and we didn't know what was going to happen. And after that, we both kept our phones available on Shabbat.
Right. And remember, that might have been a time, I don't know when that was, but it might have been a time when there weren't cell phones, right?
There weren't cell phones.
Right.
No.
So, if you were in shul, no one was going to reach you because there was no way to do it, right? And before answering machines, there was no way to leave a message, right? So I mean, so again, we just sort of get to the reality that things are in constant flux, right? But I think that this is a really important point, right? That we are independent of technical civilization, right? Meaning we abstain primarily from any activity that aims at remaking or reshaping the things of space, right? So that really raises a question. Right? Is pushing the button on an elevator, is that remaking or reshaping the things of space? Right? Or is that using a tool to save yourself from schlepping up countless flights of stairs? Right?
Is riding a Shabbos elevator any better?
Right, of course, you can get out of the problem by having a Shabbos elevator. But, right, the question, if we understand work as being about the remaking or reshaping of things of space, right? We may decide, okay, well, that doesn't actually count as malacha, right? I may have mentioned this before, right? That some of the early discussions about electricity did not consider it lighting a fire, right? And
I don't want to disrail you, but a Shabbat elevator, I never heard of that. Is this a
Oh,
new?
it is real. You'll find
Yes.
them there, every hotel.
You'll find it in New Jersey as well.
What,
You'll
what does
find
that
it here in Cambridge
Harvard
at
Hillel.
yeah,
the
exactly.
Hillel building in Cambridge has a Shabbat elevator.
Yeah. Otherwise, I couldn't come for series.
Yeah, I don't know if there are Shabbat elevators elsewhere, but I remember when that Shabbat elevator used to break all the time. It looked like the elevators at
At 100
CT.
Center Street.
Exactly, and we had one person in a wheelchair, and we actually had two people in a wheelchair. One of them was so incredibly light that some of our still brawny members could carry her up the stairs. The other one had the kind of wheelchair that no one was picking that thing up. So if the elevator was down, she couldn't come. But luckily, that seems to have. I don't know. Who knows what's going on with that elevator now? Anyway, so what are the kinds of labor not to be done on the Sabbath? They are, according to the ancient rabbis, all those acts which were necessary for the construction and furnishing of the sanctuary in the desert. Right? And so the Sabbath itself is a sanctuary which we build, a sanctuary in time.
I love that.
Right? It's a beautiful, beautiful thought, right? And I love it, right, because it acknowledges, right, that the Bible is not clear about what constitutes work, which I think is so important, and so important to remember, right, that the Bible doesn't try. And the rabbis then say, okay, well, it must be the work that's described immediately after the giving of the Torah. Right? I mean, is it logical? Is it not logical? It just is, right? They had to have some definition, right? So that's where we start from. And that's why some things that might feel like work are not classified as work, and some things that don't feel like work are classified as work, right? And which is to say, right, that everyone should feel very free to engage in the process of discernment about what qualifies as work for you, right? And for instance, like I mean, I won't get to, for instance, it'll just take us away. But to focus, right, that this is a time for us, right? This is time. This is where we get to be with ourselves, in ourselves. Okay. So it is one thing to race or be driven by the vicissitudes that menace life, and another thing to stand still and embrace the presence of an eternal moment. The seventh day. Oh, you go ahead, Ken.
Oh, I don't want to dwell on this too much, but I've been reading this book about the Scottish Enlightenment around the end of the Jacobite rebelliousness and that thing put down. So anyway, the 45 they call it, but it's going on in detail in the beginning of the book about the Sabbath, the way the Presbyterians saw it in Edinburgh at that time, where it was so serious, so serious. People were in church on their Sabbath all day long, from the moment they woke up until bedtime. And there were monitors that would go around to the stores and the pubs and tell people they had to leave, and you couldn't dance and you couldn't smile and you couldn't do this and you couldn't do that. And it's just so heavy. And I know that even in Judaism, some people interpret it as a very serious thing, but all I know is after reading that and being so immersed in it yesterday and thinking, thank God I didn't live in that space in that time. But the wording of it is just so beautiful. It's like a painting. I mean, the language turns it into this glorious time. Same kind of, we have to make a Sabbath thing called holy, but the contrast is so interesting to me now that we're, I read this in the last few weeks when we were prepared to talk about it, but it really hits me now, even looking at the words and listening, that this is the kind of Sabbath you would want to be a part of. Like, it's not work to exist in this beautiful place of love and joy and goodness. It is work to be stuck in, like, where people are beating you if you go to sleep in the 10-hour sermon. They had poking rods. They would literally poke you to make you wake up.
I grew up with that. No, I'm joking.
So anyway,
Well,
it
thank
seems
you. That's
like,
great.
so even with the word of work,
Yes.
you're not working to live like this if you can, because
I mean, one of the things that's not here, right? One of the things that's not that Heschel doesn't address, right? Presumably because he had a very dutiful wife and and he may have even had, other helpers, is that it's a lot of work to make Shabbos, right? You've got to do a lot of work before Shabbos in order to make Shabbos really work.
Yeah.
Right. So there is actually a fair amount of labor, right, involved in building that sanctuary. Right. In order to do Shabbat services, right, it takes a fair amount of effort to make sure that all the pieces are covered and that we can come together as a community and have Shabbat services. Right. There is a it's the preparation. Right? It's not a throwing off, right? Nor is it about prohibition, right? But it's not necessarily easy. All right, so the seventh day,
Excuse me.
Sure.
There's also the cleaning up from the serving of the food.
Yes, absolutely.
And that is work.
Right. Well, that's what's interesting, right? Is that washing dishes is not necessarily work, right? According in
not for a rabbi, because the rabbi didn't do it.
If there had been a woman, then dishes would be considered work.
This rabbi used to do that, but that's another story.
Right.
But I don't. That's not what I mean. What I mean is, I think that he would acknowledge that is work, but it doesn't fall into the category, right, of Shabbat Melacha, right? And so, this is what I think is very difficult to understand about Shabbat, because it's not just any sort of simple definition of work, and that's why it takes this sort of time to sort of figure out, well, what are we talking about here, right? I mean, what I was going to say is that in a traditional household, right, you just put the dishes that need to go through the dishwasher, and some people actually put the pots and pans in there too. You put them in the dishwasher and just let them sit until the end of Shabbos, and then you take care of them after Shabbos. The seventh day is an armistice, right? It's not a peace treaty, right? It's a ceasefire, right, in man's cruel struggle for existence. A truce in all conflicts, personal and social, peace between man and man, man and nature, peace within man, right? A day on which handling money is considered a desecration, on which man avows his independence of that which is the world's chief idol. I guess he's talking about money. I thought he was talking about Twitter, but maybe it's money. The seventh day is the exodus from tension, the liberation of man from his own muddiness, the installation of man as a sovereign in the world of time. All very lovely and very high flown, right? But this is where I begin to sort of, part ways a little bit with Heschel, right? Because the amount of sort of mental work and even a kind of compartmentalization, right, that you would need to do, seems to me to be really a heavy lift, really a lot of work, right? Especially in the context of a Jewish community, right, where by and large we don't gather for communal prayer during the week, right? We gather for communal prayer on Shabbat, right? So if we were never to acknowledge suffering or never to acknowledge tension, right, it just would never happen in a communal setting, right? And so this is another question, so it says in the tempestuous ocean of time and toil, there are islands of stillness where man may enter a harbor and reclaim his dignity. The island is the seventh day, the Sabbath, a day of detachment from things, instruments, and practical affairs, as well as attachment to the spirit, right? I like that idea, but I'm not completely convinced, right, that the daily struggles that many of us engage in all of us engage in various ways, right? But they are not necessarily a situation that leads to a lack of dignity, right? And having a rest from them, I think, is a good idea, right? But I'm not. I just quail a little bit. So, the Sabbath must all be spent in charm, grace, peace, and great love. For on it even the wicked in hell find peace. Which I love that. I love that idea. It is therefore that you're sitting in hell, right? You're suffering the torments of Satan, right? And then all of a sudden they stop, and Satan says, "I'm going home. It's Shabbos, and I'm gonna go hang out with Mrs. Satan, and you guys are all gonna rest for the day, and I'll come back tomorrow after Havdalah, and I'll start poking you with my broomstick again."
There's something though today that's comes to mind, that the people who were in the Holocaust at different levels and different times, they still tried their very best to observe the festivals and and Shabbat.
Yes.
Some of them did, not all.
No, I know that.
Nobody's saying.
Yeah, ones for whom it was important, right? And ones who could figure out how to do it, right? It was very important for them to do this, right? And I mean, I think one of the things that Heschel implies, right, about the business of time versus the business of space, right, is that by making our Holy of Holies a day, right, it could never be destroyed, right? Right, and that so that the resilience of the Jewish people and of Judaism, right, is based at least in part on the fact that when our physical real estate was destroyed, right, we figured out how to build a spiritual temporal real estate that you can't destroy, because you got to destroy the entire world and time, right, in order for that to be destroyed. All right, so it must all be spent in charm, grace, peace, and great love. It is therefore a double sin to show anger on the Sabbath. Ye shall kindle no fire throughout your habitations on the Sabbath day is interpreted to mean you shall kindle no fire of controversy, nor the heat of anger. Ye shall kindle no fire, not even the fire of righteous indignation. Right, and again, this is hard, right? We've run into this in the worship and study meeting. We've run into this in terms of, well, what are the appropriate boundaries of political speech on Shabbat? Right? Even in a minyan where there's relatively, there's not a lot of Trumpists, right, in the minyan, right? But there were several voices, who are not comfortable with having, openly political conversation. Go ahead, Maya.
I'm smelling some burning in here. I have to step away and go see what's going on.
Yeah, please do. I hope there's not a problem. Yeah. Okay. Out of the days through which we fight and from whose ugliness we ache, we look to the Sabbath as our homeland, as our source and destination. It is a day in which we abandon our plebeian pursuits and reclaim our authentic state. in which we may partake of a blessedness in which we are what we are, regardless of whether we are learned or not, of whether our career is a success or a failure. It is a day of independence of social conditions. Again, I think he's speaking more in ideal terms, unfortunately, than in reality, but I think it's, it's still a nice idea, right? That Shabbat is when we get to be free of our, we do tend to cluster in synagogues where we feel comfortable, right? All week we may ponder and worry whether we are rich or poor, whether we succeed or fail in our occupations, whether we accomplish or fall short of reaching our goals. But who could feel distressed when gazing at spectral glimpses of eternity, except to feel startled at the vanity of being so depressed or distressed? The Sabbath is no time for personal anxiety or care, for any activity that might dampen the spirit of joy. The Sabbath is no time to remember sins, to confess, to repent, or even to pray for relief or anything we might need. It is a day for praise, not a day for petitions. Fasting, mourning, demonstrations of grief are forbidden. The period of mourning, right, the Shiva is interrupted by Shabbat. And if one visits the sick on Shabbat, one should say it is the Sabbath. So don't complain. You shall soon be cured. I don't know. I'm not a big fan of telling people not to complain. Like if they feel the need to complain, let them complain. I'm here to listen. Shabbat or not Shabbat, yeah. I don't know. One must abstain from toil and strain on the seventh day, even from strain in the service of God, right? So I have to remember that sometimes, right? It's okay even for the rabbi to take a Shabbos off from time to time, right? Take a Shabbos from Shabbos. Why are the 18 benedictions? So if you recall, right, the regular weekday Amidah, right? We don't say that on Shabbat, right? It's because Sabbath was given to us by God for joy, as Kent was saying, right? For delight, for rest, and should not be marred by worry or grief. Right? Again, in an ideal world, I would say, if we can get ourselves to that point. And I do, but I mean, I actually think that as sort of off-putting as that might sound, right? I actually, let me read the rest of the paragraph and then I'll sort of tell you how I've been thinking about it. Right? Should there be a sick one in the household, we might remember this while reciting the benediction, heal the sick, and would become saddened and gloomy on the Sabbath day. It is for this same reason that we recite in the Sabbath grace after meals the request that there be no sadness or trouble in our day of rest. It is a sin to be sad on the Sabbath day, right? So I'm not, again, completely comfortable with that language, right? I am aware that, again, another thing that modern liberal Jews have done is to put a Misha Berach, right, which is traditionally said, at the sick bed, or if it's said in the synagogue, it's said on a Monday or a Thursday, right, when during the Torah service, right, we have generally been putting it in the Shabbat liturgy.
Yes.
Right? And the new conservative prayer book, if you notice, right, there is no Misha Berach in the old Silverman conservative prayer book that we used to use at Worship and Study, right? It hadn't become a thing yet. I believe it started in the Reform or the Reconstructionist movement. Has spread now to the conservative movement, right? And in the new prayer book, it actually says, right, even though Shabbat is not a time to cry out, we still ask for healing, right? We sort of hedge it a little bit, right? We hedge it a little bit. And that's why, right? Because it's not really considered the kosher, right? To make requests on Shabbos, right? But again, right, our lives are now such that making a Misha Berach any other time during the week is not so simple, right? So let's do it on Shabbos. And so the question, and I would actually say, right, I would argue with Heschel here, and I would say that including a Misha Berach for Holim, right, for people who are sick on Shabbat, right, actually adds to the holiness and the comfort of the day. Right? People who are worried about loved ones who are ill can be comforted by the fact that the congregation is praying for their healing. For the Sabbath is a day of harmony and peace, peace between man and within man, and peace with all things. Right, so there are people who struggle with the idea that it's a celebration, so you should eat meat. Right? But if it's a day of peace, maybe you shouldn't eat meat because, eating meat implies the killing of a living creature, right? So on the seventh day, man has no right to tamper with God's world or to change the state of physical things. Right? It is a day of rest for man and animal alike, right? And not just people, right? But also not just free people, right? But also for servants or slaves, right? It's supposed to be a day of rest, right? It goes and also, right? A maidservant, and usually it includes also the stranger within your gates.
Yes.
There it is, yeah, the stranger that is within your gates. That's why I have that in my head. But even your cattle take the day off.
Yeah.
Right? It suggests rest is a good thing for people, right? And sometimes I like to take this as an admonition, right, rather than a prohibition, right? That it's a reminder, right, that Shabbat is an opportunity to assert one's independence by resting, not a matter of knuckling under to the demands of some random black hatter about this or that thing that you're not supposed to do, right? That sort of reframing can be very, very powerful. Rabbi Solomon of Radomsk once arrived in a certain town where he was told lived an old woman who had known the famous Rabbi Elimelech. She was too old to go out, so he went to see her and asked her to tell him what she knew about the great master. She said, "I don't know what went on in his room because I worked as one of the maids in the kitchen. Only one thing I can tell you, during the week, the maids would often quarrel with one another, as is common. But week after week, on Friday, when the Sabbath was about to arrive, the spirit in the kitchen was like the spirit on the eve of the Day of Atonement. Everybody would be overcome with an urge to ask forgiveness of each other. We were all seized by a feeling of affection and inner peace." But I will point out, right, that they were still in the kitchen.
Yes, working.
So just wondering about that. I mean, I have an acquaintance, a guy I used to be in charge of a grant making organization, and we would go to Ukraine, Dnipropetrovsk, to visit this rabbi, and he had, his Shabbos table was like it's like an institution. It fit like 40 people, and obviously he had servants who were waiting the table and making sure the food, so it's again, Shabbos can take a lot of work, just to remind. The Sabbath, thus, is more than an armistice, more than an interlude, is a profound conscious harmony of man and the world, a sympathy for all things, and a participation in the spirit that unites what is below and what is above. All that is divine in the world is brought into union with God. This is Shabbat and the true happiness of the universe. So this now is getting into the language and imagery of Kabbalat Shabbat, right? Of the Friday night prayers, where we sing Lecha Dodi, which is about the mystical union between the feminine and masculine aspects of Shabbat, right? Sometimes seen as, the up and the down, right? The surface and the deep, you can sort of choose your own series of metaphors, right? But 6 days, shalt thou labor and do all thy work. Is it possible for a human being to do all his work in 6 days? Does not our work always remain incomplete? What the verse means to convey is rest on Shabbat as if all your work were done. Right? Another interpretation, rest even from the thought of labor. Right? And now this famous story, right, about the guy that sees the hole in his fence on Shabbos and decides to fix it. And then when Shabbos is over, he decides he's not going to fix it, right, until he starts losing sheep, in which case he immediately goes and fixes it. But I'm just being a little cynical. But the Sabbath as experienced by a person cannot survive in exile, a lonely stranger among days of profanity. I'm not sure I completely understand this. It needs the companionship of all other days. All the days of the week must be spiritually consistent with the day of days. Our life should be a pilgrimage to the seventh day. The thought and appreciation of what this day may bring to us should ever be present in our minds. For the Sabbath is the counterpoint of living, the melody sustained throughout all agitations and vicissitudes which menace our conscience, our awareness of God's presence in the world. What we are depends on what the Sabbath is to us. The law of the Sabbath day is the life of the Spirit, to the life of the Spirit, what the law of gravitation is in nature, right? Which is very interesting, right? That for a Jew who really observes Shabbat, right, ideally, the rules of Shabbat are not, right, a series of prohibitions and injunctions, right? It's really a matter of descriptive laws, right? Like the laws of gravitation. And, without gravity, we would all fly off into the and burn up in the atmosphere, right? Shabbat is what grounds us, right? If we choose to sort of work in that universe. Nothing is as hard to suppress as the will to be a slave to one's own pettiness. I can say that is definitely true. Right? At least for me. I'm not sure it's true for other people, but since Heschel says it, I'm assuming that it must be true for him as well. It certainly is true for me, right? There's always one more interesting looking article on Apple News that I really just need to, I need to push that and go see what it is, right? Rather than preparing for Shabbat. Gallantly, ceaselessly, quietly, man, and let's again, people must fight for inner liberty, right? And that's really what Shabbos is about, right? It's about inner liberty. Inner liberty depends on being exempt from domination of things, right? At least we can turn it off, right? As well as, and this is why I think, Lori, I was talking before about the emphasis on independence, right? To also be free from the domination of people. Right?
Yes.
Which is very difficult, even or maybe even especially at shul, right? You can look at other people and can be concerned that they're this, they're that, they have a better hat, they have a better suit, they have a better job, they know Torah better than I do, they're smarter than I am, whatever it is, right? So there's so many pitfalls, right, that we can lose track of what Shabbat is, right, which is not about any of that stuff. There are many who have acquired a high degree of political and social liberty, but only very few are not enslaved to things.
That's
so
a great
in case you were worried that you're not very good at Shabbat, please don't worry, right? Because Rabbi Heschel has just told us essentially that even he's not that good at Shabbat, right? It's an aspirational kind of a thing. And so this is our constant problem: how to live with people and remain free, right? And how to live with things and remain independent. I think that is very, very true. Right? And Shabbos can bring both of them into counterpoint.
Rabbi, quick question.
Yeah.
On the bottom of that, it says Shabbat 2832, 89.
Yeah.
What reference is that to the Talmud?
That's to this book.
To this book, okay.
Yeah. Laura, did you want to ask something?
Yeah, I have two things. One is I like the idea of Shabbat being aspirational, because if you are so set in your ways that Shabbat must be this and Shabbat must not be that, you can be very difficult to live with or live around or whatever.
Right.
And you set yourself apart. You become, dare I say, holier than thou. That only you know the right way to do Shabbat.
And yes.
And I don't know that you enjoy it if you do it that way, because you're so busy making sure you don't violate any prohibitions or do it wrong.
Right. I think that that's, on one hand, I think that that's right. On the other hand, I think that the reality right, is that um, is that uh, that it's a complicated formula, because Shabbat is davka about setting yourself apart, right? It's about setting aside this day to be different than the other days.
That I
Right.
understand, but setting yourself apart from people that are supposed to be like you,
Well,
setting
that,
yourself apart from your community.
well, there's where you go, right? Now that's where I think that's why he's saying this is our constant problem, right? Is that in whatever the group of people you're talking about, whether it's your family or it's your congregation, right? There will always be this problem, right? That how do you as a group determine what the Shabbat practice is going to be that allows everybody to feel like they're having their Shabbat practice, right? So, one thing that has been sort of a given at, just to take the example of worship and study, which several of the people in the room know about, right, is that the general rule was no technology at Shabbos, right? So people could, it wasn't like you couldn't have a phone in the room, but the idea was you left your phone in your purse or in your pocket or whatever, and you didn't touch it, right? What's going to be interesting, right, is now in the time of Zoom, right? What do we do with that, right? And how are we going to preserve a feeling of Shabbat for people who find the presence of electronic bingings and bangings to be really irritating, right? While still making sure that the people who need to use those things in order to make Shabbat happen are able to do it, right? So, some people don't want to turn on lights, right? And they live with people for whom not turning off the light, right, is a waste of energy, right? These are values in conflict, right? And just like any other value in conflict, conflict of values, right? You need to have that conversation, which is the thing that, this chapter doesn't really talk about it, right? But Shabbat ultimately, right, is about interdependence with the people around you. Figuring out how does your community celebrate Shabbat in a way that's going to be meaningful. But I think you had another thought, Lauren.
Yeah, so this actually leads to my second thought, and which is something that I've been pondering this whole session, is the prohibition, in quotes, on the use of money.
Right.
If you are part of a community in days of yore before Zoom that meets on Shabbat, and for example, a specific example is there are a number of street people in the area around Hillel.
Right.
And many of us will give them money every Shabbat.
Yeah.
No.
Which you can't do if you're not carrying money, number one. And we in our house have actually had this discussion. Should we go into Harvard Square on Shabbat afternoon and look for a particular person?
Yeah. Right. Right. And yeah, go ahead, finish.
I'm not sure where emotionally to come down on this.
Well, again, I think that this is so first of all, I would say that it's important to try to place Heschel, right, in his context. Why is he so vociferous about money? Right? What's so bad about money? Right? I don't know, right? Why it was such a sore spot for him, right? But my guess is, without knowing, it would be interesting to ask Susanna Heschel and see if she has an answer, right? But my assumption is, right, that in the 50s, right, this was the time of massive emphasis on on integration, right, and on assimilation, right, and so and arguments about well, are Jewish stores going to be open on Shabbat, right? And if they can't be open on Sunday, and they have to be open on Shabbat in order to accommodate non-Jewish customers. Right?
There was also something else.
Yeah.
I'm sorry to keep interrupting, but
No, please, that's great. If you have more information, I'm speculating.
The 50s, which is when this book was, or this writing was done, were also a moment where people felt very, very strongly that they were freed of war, and you had money, and if you had daughters, they wanted things. If you had sons, they wanted to do things with their father, and that was it. That's where the money was going.
Yeah. So, I mean, I think that, my guess is money, actually, so what you're saying, Ellen, would actually kind of argue against what I'm arguing. My argument, right, or my speculation is that this has less to do with like giving out money on Shabbos, right, to poor people, and has more to do with doing business on Shabbos.
Yes,
right?
yes.
Right. And so like, I think it's reasonable to sort of think along the lines of like, well, I'm resting from my money-making occupation, or if you're not working anymore, right? You're resting from some sort of significant activity, and that this that money is a symbol, right, of something that you're resting from, right, has a slightly different balance today.
Yes.
Right. I have to say that I do, feel liberated when I leave my wallet at home on Shabbat morning.
Yes.
I also know that I generally go directly. I don't go home and drop my wallet at home and then come back to work for Kabbalat Shabbat. So I'm also aware that I'm less unencumbered on Shabbat evening, right? So again, I think it's all, and like if part of your Shabbat practice is to get a cup of coffee at Pete's with friends, right? Then you need money in order to do that.
Yeah.
Right. And so again, I think that, Heschel talks in absolutes, right? And I think that every one of your objections, Lori, is completely valid and is not, it shouldn't be a question of a yes or a no, right? It should be a question of, okay, well, what are the two values here, right? What are the two values that we are trying to keep that are somewhat in conflict?
So there's one more question that's a corollary of that. Is there anything written about giving tzedakah on Shabbat?
I'm not sure. It hasn't come up in such a clear way in my experience for me. Now there must be, what I can tell you is that when I started being Jewish, that we used to go to Temple Israel, and the rabbi would say at the end of the service, he would say, if you carry money on Shabbos, be sure to put some in the tzedakah box on the way out of shul. So I think that we can trust Rabbi Friedman, and that if you carry money on Shabbos, then you better be given tzedakah.
Well, there's this tradition to empty your pockets into the pushki on
Right.
Friday night before Shabbos.
Right. Since emptying your pockets means now putting your credit card in, it's not so, it's not exactly the same, but yes.
Right.
Yeah. All right, so we should switch gears to the Hebrew. Anyone who would like to stay, anyone who is overwhelmed already by the amount of Hebrew they've done this week, feel free not to stay. So one question I wish I had remembered to ask before Anne and someone else left, but I can't. I can never remember who leaves from these things. But Helen. No,
yeah.
it was Kent. Kent left. Okay. One thing I meant to ask you. So we are, as you know, the Worship and Study Minion has decided that our bar bat mitzvah is going to be a gala affair, raising money for tzedakah, right? Raising money for the 3 charities that the Worship and Study Minion chose. Now what feels like forever ago, but whenever it was that we chose.
2 years ago.
What are they?
This is. I'm not going to answer that question only because I want to get on to other things.
Yeah.
But the information is available. We can get it to. But the question. But I am also going to. I'm also going to have an opportunity for people at Hebrew Senior Life who want to give to Hebrew Senior Life. So we are going to have a kind of a mailing and a landing page for people who would prefer. So we're going to give people an option. Because some of the people, relatives of Heva who want to give might not want to give to to random charities that someone else has selected, right? They might want to give to Hebrew Senior Life. So we will. I will be getting all that sort of stuff to you. ASAP. Yeah, go ahead, Ellen.
I saw the preliminary one that you sent out, and I like having the Hebrew Senior Life option. And when I make a list, I've got a good 20 people that I think would want to come. And
Right.
Even if each one puts in just 10 or 20 bucks,
Right.
we can really make some money for these.
Exactly.
Yeah.
And so the charities, I think Lori's sheet has the charities listed.
Yeah, we do. And if you need another copy, I'll get it to you.
Great. Yeah, please send it to me because they're not coming through correctly to me for some reason. So Lori,
You
why don't
should
you
have gotten one in snail mail yesterday or
great.
today.
I haven't opened it yet. So great. Okay, good.
Yeah.
All right, good. So go ahead, Ellen.
Good job, everyone.
On page 52, how do you pronounce the Hebrew word for love? And how do you pronounce the Hebrew word for heart?
Okay, so the Hebrew word for love is ahava.
Can you say that again?
Yep, ahava.
Ahava?
Ahava.
Yes.
Oh, isn't there like a skincare line called that? or something?
Yes, there is. And it's,
And how do you, did you say lev for heart?
Lev. Yeah, lev or lev. Yeah, lev or lev.
Which is the first one and which is the second one?
What's
What?
lev? It's
So there's two
lev
words
and
for heart.
it's lev and levav.
What's again?
The first word there is lev,
Yeah.
and the second one is levav. And they both mean heart. Lev with one vet is much more common.
How do you say generation?
Door.
Door, okay. And then I have the other question. If you have a hey in the sentence, you don't use a Hebrew pronoun, but if you don't have a hey before the noun, then you use the Hebrew pronoun? You still
Not exactly sure what you're talking about. Can you point me to an example?
Okay, let me just look it up. I have to look at my notes.
I remember last week we talked about the forms of house and bevet.
Yeah.
Then I was delighted to be in service last Shabbat, I guess, and there was a prayer. Bait Yisrael, the house
Yeah,
of
Beit Yisrael.
Yay.
Yay, exactly. Exactly. So ahava, right? Very important word, ahava. Adon is also a very important word, right? Lord or master. And when we say Adonai, right, we are saying my masters, literally my masters.
Oh.
Which
Adon.
is one of those wonderful paradoxes of Judaism, right? That we are forever proclaiming the oneness, right? The unity of God, right? And we so often call God by a plural, right? And I love that because it is I think it gets at the the degree to which you can't pin that down, right? I also love that in relation to Heschel, right? That God is in time, right? We don't have to locate God in space, right? Because we can locate God in time. Or Ellen, you're muted. If you want to say something to me, you're muted.
Not I.
Can you hear me
Not the
now?
other one. Yep.
Page 37.
Yeah.
Number 4.
Okay.
When you say the Sabbath is holy. Wait. When you say the Sabbath is holy, you only use 2 words. But number 2, when you say many words are blessed, you use 3 words and you put the pronoun in.
Well, HaShabbat, right? Kadosh.
Yeah.
Right?
And then many words you have to use the pronoun of.
So Devarim, Rabim, Mivarachim. Is that what they say?
So the first one is HaShabbat Kadosh, right?
Yeah, but I think so. But I'm not going to trust myself. I'm going to go.
Yeah. And what is number 2? You use the pronoun.
Well, you can always look at the answers. Devarim, Rabim, Haim, Baruchim. Yeah.
Yeah, you use the pronoun. Haim.
Yeah, because you're asking me why?
So in the first one, there's no pronoun, but in the second one, there is a pronoun.
Oh, HaShabbat Kedosha. Yeah.
The first one, because
Oh,
there's
right. I think that's right because I think I think it's because it's the Shabbat, right?
So
is
there's no
holy.
pronoun.
There's no pronoun, right? Because there's the definite article, the ha.
But
Right?
in the second one, there's no definite article, so you have to use a pronoun.
Exactly.
Is that right?
Yep, that sounds right to me.
So if you use the definite article, you don't use a pronoun. But if you use an adjective with no definite article, there is a pronoun.
Sure. Sounds good.
Is that right?
Sounds good to me. I like it.
Okay, thank you.
All right, good. So let's go back to page 52.
Yeah.
So ahava and or are important words in the first 2 blessings before the Shema, right? The first blessing before the Shema is called Yotzer Or, right?
Mhm.
Creator of light, right?
R? Is it R?
Or Yotzer. Don't worry about the word Yotzer. I'm just telling you that's the title. But the word or, right, is very important in that first blessing, right? Ahava Rabbah, right, is the second blessing before the Shema. Right? So great love, right? So the blessing about the revelation of the Torah is all about God's love, about Ahava, right? So that's why these 2 words are here. Dor, right, is also a very important concept in Judaism, right? Ledor vador, right? From generation to generation. You probably heard that word.
Yes.
That phrase, right? So and that is it. Even though it's a masculine noun, the plural, which doesn't come along so often, I don't think in the prayer book, but it is a feminine form. Chag, right? A very important word. the same word as in Arabic, Hajj. Right? Does everyone know what Hajj is?
Mhm.
Pilgrimage.
Pilgrimage, right? Every adult Muslim is supposed to make a pilgrimage to Mecca, right? So in Deuteronomy, it says that every male of your household should make Hajj 3 times a year to Jerusalem. So that's why we still have, as a kind of an aspiration, right, that Jews will go to Jerusalem for one of the pilgrimage holidays. And we also see this in our celebration of Sukkot, right, and Simchat Torah, when we walk around the sanctuary with our lulavim or with our Torah shtos, right? We walk in a circle. That's a hag. That's a chag, right? It's a walking around in a circle. Kavod, I actually mentioned this word kavod earlier, right? When I talked about kavod habriot, right? The honor, right, or the dignity of every living being, right? That every living being is due honor, has an inherent dignity and honor, right? It also is kavod Hashem, right? The glory of God, God's presence. We already talked about Lev, right? Heart, right? So it'd be interesting to, I'm not, and I'm not coming up right off the top of my head with an example from the prayer book. I know that I see that maybe it's in the Elenu, Levav Shalem, that's where you actually see, and Livavecha, right? Oh yeah, and of course in the Shema, right? Ve'ahavta et Adonai, right? B'chol levavcha, with your entire heart, right? You're supposed to love God with your entire heart. So duh, I should have thought of that. Go ahead, Maya.
It's in the same exercises that Ellen was looking at page 7. If you've got that, it gets to many are the sons, is the last one. Many are the sons. And it says Rabim Habanim. And I'm wondering why the Rav changes to a B there. I thought Rav would be V all the way through.
Yes, good question. It's a very good question. And actually, it's in a way, it's kind of related to the whole business of Lev, right? In Livavot, right? Which behaves exactly the opposite. So this is, so when you put a dagesh in it, right? A dot, that what that often is signaling is a double vowel. I'm sorry, a double consonant. So the consonant is doubled. Now there's 2 ways of doubling consonants in Hebrew. The far more common way is to do a kind of an abbreviation, right? And you stick a dot in it. That means there's 2.
Okay.
Okay. The problem with that, right, is that certain letters, including bet, right, change their pronunciation when you stick a dot in it, right?
Okay.
So basically, from a linguistic perspective, and excuse me, everyone else who's not as much of a linguist as mine, because this might be a little bit complicated, but so the problem with the dagesh, right, is that if you have say you have the word bite, right, putting a dot at the beginning of that word does not mean that there are 2, that does not mean there's 2 vets there, right? It means that at the beginning, it's because of the beginning of a word, right? That letter sounds as a b and not a v, right?
Okay.
All right. But if you double, but also when you double the bet, as in Rabim, right? It's really like Resh, Vet, Yud, Mem, Sofit. Right? That doubling is abbreviated with a dagesh. And so what do? We see a dagesh, we make it into a ba.
Okay.
How do you say evil? How do you say-
We'll get there in a second. We'll get there in a second, Ellen. All right. So if we go back now to page 52, right, we'll see that the plural of heart, right, is livavot, two vets, but it's really spelled livavot, right? So we don't put the bet in. We don't put the dagesh in there, even though there's a two B's in a row.
If you did, then it would mean it changed to B, I guess, to a B.
Right, it would be like libot or something like this.
Okay.
All right. So what I can say, right, is that the rules of Hebrew orthography are sufficiently complicated that not only are they too complicated for me to explain clearly, I think they would just confuse you. So I think this is one of those situations in which the learner, it does best to sort of say, that's a weird one.
Just
Yeah.
learn it. Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah.
But know that it's not necessarily irregular, and that you will encounter other ones like it. But again, as long as you trust that your prayer book doesn't have a typo, you're good to go.
Yeah.
And we should trust that, huh? Okay.
Yeah.
I mean, for the most, prayer books do have typos, and I'm saying that both as a consumer of prayer books and as a maker of prayer books. So I know that they have typos because they're made by humans. So, they're in the prayer book that we used to use at CCB on Friday nights. There's one place where they spell a sh as a s or vice versa, and it bothers me every single time I see it. But look, it's making a prayer book is a human endeavor. So there's all right. The word ra, right? The word ra is evil or bad, right? But it's also like yetzer hara. So yetzer is the word for inclination, right? So we call it the evil inclination, right? But remember that as with everything else in the world, right? It's hard to have only good, right? If you didn't have stuff that we would call negative or evil or bad, right? We wouldn't be able to have good. And so it's an interesting thing where you'll see this ra, right, in one of the prayers in the beginning of the prayer book, right, is that it asks God to shield us from the yetzer hara, right? Take us away from the evil inclination. But of course, without the evil inclination, we wouldn't do much. We would just sit around. Right?
You say ra'ot or ra'aot?
That is first of all, it's an adjective, which I guess why they're giving you all of those forms, right? Ra is masculine singular, Ra'ah is feminine singular, Ra'im is masculine plural, and Ra'ot is feminine plural. All right, so we see the possessive endings, right? The ones that happen most often, right, is Beitenu. Beitenu is the most, Enu happens a lot in Eloheinu. Eloheinu, Velohei Avotenu, Imotenu, right? That is a very common one, right? Our height is much about their stuff or your stuff, right? We do tend to talk about Beitcha, right? About God as in the second person singular. So that one is pretty common, as is Beito, right? His sorry, everybody.
Okay.
Is anyone there? Not sure quite what happened there, but Okay, now we're all back. Okay. Sorry about that.
I have to go now.
Okay.
Bye.
All right, sounds good. Bye-bye, Ellen, soon. All right, so any other questions before we, is chapter 8 a good one to do for next week, or are people feeling like they can make that progress, or do we want to stay on chapter 7?
I still need to be on chapter 7, but that's okay. If other people need to go to progress, I'm okay with that as well.
Where are you? I didn't hear everything about.
Okay. I'm still struggling through chapter 7. So, but if other people are
Great.
more advanced, I'll continue plugging through.
Great, right, and you have any specific questions, or you just
No, I'm
getting through?
just getting through.
Awesome. All right, so we do have services tonight at Goldman, Heather, and tomorrow morning. So in person in the community room, and everybody else. It's great to see you. Thank you so much for being here for a good session. We'll pick it up again next week.
And thank you, Rabbi.
Thank you.
And